The Revolutionary War started as a colonial rebellion against the British on the fringes of its empire. It ended with an independent America and the idea of liberty spreading across the globe. All this happened because the rebels won the major battles. We're here to dive deep into each of them. Welcome to the Key Battles of the Revolutionary War podcast, hosted by James Early and Scott Rank. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our series on key battles in the Revolutionary War. In the last episode, America is triumphant. Washington bravely crosses the Delaware River, not quite in the way that we see in the painting. He's not in a rowboat. The walls are much higher, and he's not going to make himself such an easy target for sharpshooters. So, James, would you say that the Revolutionary War is basically over at this point, and there's no hope for the British?
Oh, no. That was just an embarrassing minor defeat, let's say, at Trenton and Princeton, or two defeats, or three, depending on how you count it. But, oh no, they've still got plenty of soldiers and plenty of resolve to defeat this rebellion.
They are down, but they are not out. Yeah, the Americans did defeat the Redcoats at Trenton and Princeton, but from at least a strategic standpoint, you can see how the British are still in a really good situation. All they'd really have to do is find a way to sever communication in New England. The British Navy could easily patrol the Hudson. And if you can separate communication in New England, then you can crush regions individually. So it looks good on paper, but there are some problems underneath the surface. They're bubbling to the surface. Howe's troop strength is a problem. We always think of the Americans as having the problems keeping their army together, and they do, but it's not easy to be able to maintain troop numbers. American armies can seem like they dissolve at the drop of a hat, but they can also seem to grow out of thin air. British casualties are a lot more difficult to replace because it takes about a month to move troops from England to North America. And recruitment in England isn't going too well. Almost from the beginning, the king had to recruit large numbers of Scottish Highlanders and Catholic Irish, and using mercenaries from German principalities. Even if you were a Tory, even if you were a loyalist in America, the troops fighting for the British could seem as equally foreign to you as they would to a patriot. And then another problem that we're really going to see in this episode is British treatment of civilians. Even if you have pro-British policies as an American, you're starting to feel alienated by British and Hessian troops. So if you're a woman, whether you're a Tory or a patriot, there are many who were raped, they were abused. Civilians are advised to stay indoors at night. Those caught outside were often beaten and robbed. If you complain to the British authorities, that really didn't do you much good, and it could be seen as treasonous, especially if you were a merchant and an officer was in your debt, then hey, just lock him up. Okay, my debt is taken care of. So all that to say, as we're going to see in this episode, treatment of civilians is something that over the long arc of the war is going to turn the population against the British. That's where we are. James, I'm really excited to meet our next British commander. He's a very colorful character out of a whole cast of colorful characters. Set this up for us. Who's going to lead things as we get into Saratoga?
All right. Well, this commander is a lot of fun. We're gonna enjoy him while we have him, which won't be too long, but not to give too much away here. But if our listeners remember, quite some time ago, we talked about how when Thomas Gage was still in charge of the British forces in North America, and they were in Boston, he received some reinforcements, and with those reinforcements came three major generals. One of them was William Howe, who we've seen ended up replacing Gage, and as we're talking right now, Howe is still the overall commander in charge of the British forces in North America. There was Henry Clinton, and the third one was General John Burgoyne. Burgoyne, we're going to give him a little bit of a mini biography here because he's just a very colorful character, as Scott mentioned, and as I said, lots of fun. So let's dig into his pre-Revolutionary War career. His father was a captain in the army, but he had little money, and Burgoyne himself, John Burgoyne, joined the army as a teenager. And he married young into a noble family, so he knew how to marry well. But like a lot of people in high society, he gambled heavily, and he had to end up selling his commission to pay his debts. Our listeners may remember that in the British Army, if you wanted to be an officer at this time, you didn't go to the equivalent of West Point or anything like that. There was no ROTC, or you just bought it. So you had to pay a certain amount of money depending on what rank you wanted. So he had gotten a lieutenant's commission, but he had to actually sell that. So he had to give up being a lieutenant in the Army and let somebody else take his place so that he could take the money and pay off his debts. And then he fled to France to flee the other ones, because that's what you do, right? If you can't pay your debts, you run. And then finally his father-in-law paid his debts. That was very nice of him to do, and got him another commission in the Army. And this is just in time for the 7 Years' War. So during the 7 Years' War, Burgoyne commanded a dragoon unit with excellent. Dragoons are kind of like cavalry, a different kind of cavalry back then. And by 1760, Burgoyne was a colonel in charge of a light dragoon regiment. I can't even say it right. He fought in Europe. He did not fight in North America like some of the other British and American commanders that we've mentioned. But Burgoyne captured Valencia, Spain, and became a hero. He was very popular with his men. Just a lot of fun to be around. Great guy, good man to have at a party. 1761, he became a member of Parliament, and there he constantly lobbied for a more prestigious command. He had his sights set on being a general, not just a colonel. Finally, in 1775, as I alluded to earlier, he was sent to Boston along with Clinton, and also Cornwallis was sent. Cornwallis at the time was a brigadier general. From Boston, Burgoyne constantly wrote letters complaining about Gage, Howe, and Clinton. Like a lot of these British generals, he thought he was the best and the others were inferior to him. Later that year, he was put in charge of a force sent north to drive the Patriots' Northern Army out of Canada. But there he conflicted with Sir Guy Carleton, the British governor of Canada. So even though Burgoyne was loved by his men, he was not loved by other generals. Finally, we'll just mention again that he loved wine, women, song, and the high life, so much so that he was nicknamed Gentleman Johnny.
Yeah, I love those reverse nicknames, Little John, like in Robin Hood myth. Burgoyne is interesting. He's sort of like the Hessians we saw 2 episodes ago. Their ineptness made them legend. We think that with the Battle of Trenton, that the Hessians are absolutely dead drunk lying in the streets, and Washington, the Patriots, roll over them. Not the case. Similar with Burgoyne, there are legends about him that aren't exactly true. One of them having to do with his wine, women, and song reputation when he goes on the Saratoga campaign. The legend is that he not only brings along his mistress, but he brought along 4 cartloads of belongings that belonged to his mistress, or at least he brought a lot of unnecessary stuff. Well, he did, but it's not quite to the excess that some of the legend says. That might be oral history. There is a book called Burgoyne and the Saratoga Campaign by Douglas Cubison, and he went through Burgoyne's papers. What he found was that Cubison was loved by his men, as James said. He was held in high admiration, and he brought along some unnecessary stuff, but it wasn't cartloads and cartloads, as if he was bringing a player piano and, I don't know, a plaster bust of the head of Aristotle to equip his office. It's more that he doesn't prepare too well in the campaign, so it makes it seem that he's more careless than he actually is. We'll get into this more later, and this will make more sense, but plenty of legends about him because he's such an interesting fellow.
All right. So, yes, interesting fella. Definitely, he's not some kind of wimp or anything. I mean, he definitely wants to fight and he wants to defeat the American army. He's not just there for the party, but he'll try to bring as much as the party as he can with him, but not as much as has previously been thought, perhaps. All right. So here's his plan. It's actually a very good plan. Like a lot of plans, we'll see if it actually works out or not. So Burgoyne went to London and presented a plan to Lord George Germain. He was the British Secretary of State for North America. And the plan was as follows. So there are going to be 3 different forces that are going to join forces. They're going to combine their efforts, and hopefully, as Scott already alluded to, and I've already alluded to in a previous episode, we're going to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. So here's how it would work. One force under the command of Burgoyne himself would march south from Montreal down the Hudson River Valley. He wanted 8,000 British regulars, 2,000 Canadian militia, and 1,000 Indian scouts. He's not going to get near that much, but he will get a pretty good-sized army to start with. So he's going to go south from Canada. The second, smaller force would invade New York from Niagara, which is to the west, through the Mohawk Valley and link up with Burgoyne's force at Albany. And this is going to be under the command of a colonel named Barry St. Ledger, or some people I've seen it pronounced Silliger, so I don't know which one is correct, but it's spelled ST period and then LEGER, so I'm just going to say St. Ledger. The third force was going to be Howe's force, which we've already discussed in some length. This is the same army that kicked George Washington out of New York and all the way into Pennsylvania. Howe's army, according to Burgoyne's plan, would march north from New York City and also join with Burgoyne. So the three forces are going to converge at Albany. And again, as I've already said, this would cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. The combined army would turn then and crush New England, which was the heart of the rebellion. There was a lot more loyalist sentiment in New York and some of the middle colonies as well as the southern colonies than there was in New England. A lot of the British commanders and even some of the politicians back in London thought if we could just throw a bunch of these New England guys in jail and defeat the army in New England, the other colonies will fall into line. So that's what the plan is. So Germain says, yeah, that's a good plan. He approved it. Burgoyne returned to Canada, sending a letter to Howe, notifying him, that is Howe, of his plans via a letter that he wrote on the way. So that is the plan. How does that sound to you, Scott? Good plan?
Plans on paper are always fantastic. They never fail. Now, reality sometimes intrudes. So what happens when these plans crash against the rocky shores of reality?
Yeah, there were some, I can't remember which famous general in history said this, but they said a plan only lasts as long as the minute the battle starts, and then it goes out the window or something like that. So,
or Mike Tyson, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Same kind of idea.
Exactly. Yeah. So here's what happened. Burgoyne assembled 8 regiments and was ready to set off from Fort St. John, which is just south of Canada, on June 12th. This is 1777, by the way. We're into 1777. But he was ordered to leave 2 regiments behind, so he left with only 3,700 regular troops. That is less than half of what he really wanted, but he'll have to make do. But he was also given 3,000 Hessians, jawohl, and 450 Canadians and Loyalists, and about 400 Indians. So this gave him a total of about 7,500 men, give or take. Still far less than he wanted. He had requested about 11,000. But 7,500 men, that's a pretty good sized force. He had many artillery pieces, although it would be very difficult to transport them. Remember, we keep saying this again and again. We sound like a broken record, but it bears repeating that roads are either horrible or non-existent. It depends on what part of the country you're in. So they're going to have to do a lot of their traveling down alongside rivers, in particular this time the Hudson River and Lake Champlain. Well, Lake Champlain and then the Hudson River.
Think of Napoleon's army getting stuck in Russian mud as they're trying to invade Russia. Same kind of thing happening here. And one other point, too, perhaps you could consider it a strategic mistake in hindsight. I don't know if it would be at the time. But the enlistment of those 400 Indians bothered Americans due to the nature of frontier life, where you don't have a Geneva Convention or war crimes, but at least from the American side, they would think that enlisting Indians would violate the proper conduct of war, since from their perspective, they would imagine raiding parties and the Indians not fighting according to decorum, but raiding, perhaps scalping people. That was their perspective. Many Americans are thinking, well, first the British are bringing over Hessian mercenaries, now they're enlisting Indians that could wreak havoc on them, not just fight them and conquer them. And even when Burgoyne left for Fort Edward on the Hudson River, there was a party of Indians that attacked the farm of the Tory, John Allen, in Camden Valley and killed and scalped his entire family. These are the stories that get spread around. This is something that doesn't warm up American sentiment. And that's one other thing I just want to mention before we get into the march.
As we saw, Burgoyne had another force that he was hoping to link up with under Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Ledger. He's off to the west, and he's supposed to march eastward toward Burgoyne. So on June 20th, Burgoyne issues a proclamation to the people of New England that read, and this is a quote, he said, "I have but to give stretch to the Indian forces under my direction, and they amount to thousands, to overtake the hardened enemies of Great Britain and America. I consider them the same, wherever they may lurk. If notwithstanding these endeavors and sincere inclinations to effect them, the frenzy of hostility should remain, I trust I shall stand acquitted in the eyes of God and men in denouncing and executing the vengeance of the state against the willful outcasts. Don't mess with me or I'm going to destroy you.
I suppose one could consider this his own Sherman's March to the Sea, that he's going to use very harsh measures in order to take out an otherwise intransigent enemy. Is that one way you can look at it, or would you see?
Yeah, I think so. He's saying no mercy.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. Okay, well, let's get on with the march and see how it goes.
All right, so they set off on June 20th, 1777. By July 6th, they reached Fort Ticonderoga, and it only had 2,500 Americans in it. And these men, they were under Arthur St. Clair, American young commander there, young at the time. And they evacuated. They fled eastward toward Vermont, or it wasn't Vermont back then, but work with me, people. Okay, it was the Grants. New York and New Hampshire were kind of both claiming it. But anyway, what we would call Vermont today. So they're out of the picture. The fort had a great deal of cannon and supplies, which fell into the hands of the British. So here it's the exact opposite of what happened 2 years earlier in 1775. Remember when Colonel at the time, Colonel Knox, Henry Knox, went up there. Originally it was Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen seized Fort Ticonderoga from the British, and Henry Knox brought a lot of supplies out of there, especially cannon, but it had been restocked. And now the opposite of what happened with Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold occurs. The British take it right back, and they get some supplies. So turnabout is fair play, I suppose.
Yes.
The Army had 30 extra wagons with materials to support Burgoyne's lavish lifestyle. And again, not like he was bringing thousands of casks of champagne and fine china and a piano and all that. That probably didn't happen. But nevertheless, he did have quite a bit of wine and things like that, as well as legitimate supplies. So after they took Fort Ticonderoga, Burgoyne's army was forced to move very slowly. They took 18 days to reach Fort Edward, which is only 3 miles below Ticonderoga. So 18 days to go 3 miles. That's pretty rough. Yeah. His supply train had a hard time making it through the New York wilderness, and the Americans didn't help his cause any. American militia, they felled trees, they destroyed bridges, and they dammed streams to slow the British. So they're kind of not at this point shooting at him, but they are doing everything they can to hinder his movement.
Washington had a nice way to phrase this, that he was going to let the forest fight for him.
Yeah, that's right. You talked earlier about men just kind of coming out of nowhere. Well, these are men that had shown up, had come from their homes, and they just seem to appear out of nowhere. They seem to be in the forest. So, yeah, it was like the forest. It's almost like in the Lord of the Rings movies. Remember that when the trees start marching, they go fight. You don't want to fight trees. Anyway, so in Albany, General Philip Schuyler issued a call for volunteers to stop the British. He had about 3,000 Continentals and about 1,500 militia. He wrote a letter to Congress asking for more troops. Congress replied by replacing it. They said, no, but you're fired. So they fired General Schuyler with General Horatio Gates. And Horatio Gates is going to be commander of the Department of the North, which was Schuyler's old job. Schuyler hadn't done a fantastic job, and Gates had a lot of military experience. And so they thought, well, let's give him a try.
So what's the case here? Are we going to replace an incompetent general with a more competent one or not? Well,
that's hard to answer because Gates is a mixed bag. Gates has a mixed record. Let's just see what happens. I don't want to give too much away, but Gates is going to have some good battles and some bad battles. So I think he's replacing an incompetent one with an inconsistent one. How about that? Will that work for now?
Yeah, we're going to see which one is better. Is it better to be incompetent or inconsistent? I think we're going to find out.
Yeah, let's see. Anyway, so Schuyler's out of the picture. So let's talk about Horatio Gates. He's going to be the American commander, the adversary of General Burgoyne. Horatio Gates was born in Britain to a servant woman and was rumored to be illegitimate. Never a good way to start off life, especially in Britain where it's very class conscious. Gates served as an officer in the British Army during the French and Indian War, so he was actually a regular British officer, unlike Washington. We talked about that earlier. George Washington desperately wanted, when he was a young man, he wanted a commission as a British regular officer, but they would never give it to him. So he was just a militia commander, Washington was. But Gates was actually in the regular army, but he was sloppy with his dress. And by this time, he'd, of course, gone to the Patriot cause, and he had joined the Continental Army and been made a general. And he felt that that is Gates, not Washington, should be the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. So a lot of big egos running around here, Scott. And this will not be the last one that we see. These generals all think they should be the top dog, and everybody else should just report to them. We'll see if that turns out to be the case or not. When the revolution broke out, as I said, he sided with the rebels, and Washington made him his adjutant general, so really kind of number 2 man in the Continental Army. Washington later sent him north to assist Philip Schuyler, but Gates and Schuyler quarreled. Surprise, surprise. We're going to see Gates is going to be a very quarrelsome, one of many quarrelsome commanders, just like Burgoyne was. Gates actually went to Congress, and he denounced Schuyler, so he didn't go through the chain of command. He didn't do what he was supposed to. He just, when he got mad about a commander, he'd run to Congress. He also, he went to complain about Washington right before the Battle of Trenton. I didn't even mention that because I didn't think it was all that significant. But Gates has already got, his background is troubling. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, he did have friends in Congress, so that might have been part of the reason that he was able to get this commission. And Schuyler, he doesn't want to leave his quarters in Albany, so he's not really a take charge type of general. So, we'll see if Gates is any different.
Yeah, Gates at least will go out with his army, go out in the field. And Gates did have friends in Congress, and Gates was not the only one that thought Gates should be the number 1 man. There were several in Congress that thought Washington ought to be given a pink slip and replaced by Gates. Finally, on August 19th, Gates took charge of the Northern Department. Washington sent him reinforcements, including Generals Benjamin Lincoln and Benedict Arnold. And both of those are actually very good commanders. We've seen Arnold has, up to this point, he's served very bravely. He's served competently. He's done about the best he could. We'll see how he does at Saratoga. Meanwhile, Burgoyne continues to march very slowly southward. And then on August 3rd at Fort Edward, Burgoyne received a message from Howe. And it was written on July 17th, so it was already more than 2 weeks old. And the message from Howe told Burgoyne that Howe, was not moving north up the Hudson, but had instead sailed with his army toward Philadelphia. So, surprise, I'm not coming to the party. I regret to inform you that I won't be able to make it. So, Burgoyne probably thought, you did what?
Wow. I can't imagine being a commander at this time when you're not in regular contact with Central Command. You're trying to fight on behalf of an empire that's an ocean away in the 18th century. This is messy on all sides. I just can't imagine how bewildering it is when an enormous piece of your battle plan, oh, by the way, I'm not going to be there. Go get him, Tiger.
Yeah, exactly. It's a lot worse than somebody just not showing up for lunch, standing you up. It's like, oh, great, several thousand guys that I really was counting on will not be here. So you got to think Burgoyne was thinking at this point, oh, crap, this is not, it's not the way I wanted things to go. Now, there is some controversy and to this day, some questioning about why Howe didn't do it. Why Howe decided to go off to Philadelphia rather than to go to Burgoyne. Well, for example, Dr. Alan Gelzo, who is a professor, forget where he's at exactly, but he does a lot of teaching company courses, and he does a course on the American Revolution. He said that Howe acknowledged receipt of Burgoyne's letter and therefore knew about Burgoyne's plans, but he also says, Gelzo says, that Germain ordered Howe to go to Philadelphia. So, is Germain at fault? That is the political boss who's in charge of, the government official who's in charge of this whole war effort. Is it Germain? Is it Howe? I've read elsewhere that Howe didn't want to take orders from Burgoyne because Howe is the commander in chief, so Burgoyne can't tell him what to do. So is that involved? Did Howe just think it was a lot more important to try to go capture the American capital, Philadelphia? Because that's the rules of European warfare, right, Scott? If you capture the capital, they're supposed to surrender. So it's hard to really pin down exactly what was going through Howe's head. But regardless of why he did this, and it's probably a combination of everything I said and maybe even some other factors as well. Howe is not going to be there. All right. Scott, did you want to add something about that?
Yeah, I mean, part of, I think, Howe's idea, like you said, he wanted to take out Philadelphia, the capital. And his thinking is Howe's thinking he could destroy Washington's army, and then Burgoyne would do a mop-up operation of whatever militia was raised up from New England. So if both of them are successful, the idea is that Howe could turn to the south, send troops to Virginia or the Carolinas, and then Burgoyne and Clinton would continue to mop up resistance in New England, and the war would be over. Britain would win. Howe would win the PR campaign. He'd, be the conquering general. And there's also sort of the jockeying for prestige. Not Burgoyne, but him would get the credit for victory. That's one interpretation as well. It's hard to know exactly. All that to say, poor coordination on their part. They were not on the same page.
Yeah, and a lot of it, like you implied, is communication, and there's this rivalry, as you also alluded to. Both sides, we see this. We've already seen, remember when Charles Lee wouldn't send troops, that even though Washington essentially ordered him to, Lee would not send troops down to Pennsylvania to reinforce Washington. And the only way Washington eventually got the troops was when Lee was captured, because he was with a lady of the night in an inn. Anyway.
Many 18th century generals and heads of state have been taken out in that way.
Oh, probably a lot. Probably more than we know. But the fact is that you don't have on either side a team of generals who are willing to, I guess, check their egos and put aside their own agenda and work as a team, work for the cause rather than to promote their own glory and their own agenda.
There's no general staff.
Yeah, you don't have general staff. You don't have a General George Marshall, let's say, in World War II, who's coordinating, who's everything from the center, from Washington. Anyway, so Burgoyne, having realized or learned that Howe is not coming to the party, then he gets another letter. More bad news. He learns that St. Ledger's force that was supposed to come from the west had been blocked and defeated at Fort Stanwix on August 7th. A force under Benedict Arnold. Again, Benedict Arnold makes a great contribution. And they ran over there and they stopped St. Ledger. They drove him back. And St. Ledger just said, well, I guess I'm not going to be able to do this. So, he goes home, or he goes back. So I'm sure Burgoyne was delighted to hear that news. Oh, brilliant. Great. So 1 out of 3 ain't bad, right? So Burgoyne realizes he's all alone. He's not getting any help. If he's going to go down and defeat the Americans and take control of the Hudson Valley and cut off New England, he's going to have to do it himself. He's on his own. At the same time, his supply train is starting to dry up. Remember, they had taken a lot of supplies with them, but they'd moved a lot more slowly than they had intended to. And, you have to eat every day, right? So the number of they had taken supplies for X number of days, but it had taken 2X or 3X number of days to actually get to where they were going to go. And so they're running out of food and other important supplies. So things are starting to look kind of bad for Gentleman Johnny.
Yes, an army marches on their stomach, and they did not plan. They're moving at about, 800 feet per day? I don't know if they're still...
1, 2, 3, 4. We're done. Take a break. Yeah, but they're constantly having to move trees that have been felled and saw them up and do things like that. So
Fun fact, they're moving at about 1/1000th the pace of the Mongols. Granted, if you're an entirely horseback mounted army going over the plains of Eurasia, it's much simpler. But I think, Burgoyne, swallow your pride, brother. Get pack animals. I know it's not as sexy as having a bunch of wagons and all that stuff, but hey, if you got to move through a forest, just get a bunch of donkeys and make it work. I don't know the details about logistics here. It's something that I'm interested on the side. I did a little episode a long time ago on how did Alexander and his men go so far into Asia when they were essentially living off the land of 20 or 30,000 soldiers, but this seems to be the wrong method of movement through the terrain. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. All right, when they're in Vermont, what happens next as they are undermanned and undersupplied?
all right, well they're still actually in New York, but they're going to send the command. Well, Burgoyne on August 11th, he sends the commander of his German troops to the town of Bennington, which is in Vermont. It's right across the what we would call today the state line. They didn't really have a firm state line back then, but there was rumored to be a supply depot. That's why Burgoyne sent these Germans. They're over there to rustle up some grub, as we would say down here in the South. And it was supposed to be weakly guarded. So the Germans would go grab these supplies, chase off the few Americans that were probably there, and then move southward, recruiting more troops and meeting Burgoyne in Albany. That business of recruiting guys along the way, that never really works out like it's supposed to. But hey, let's give it a try. Now, Burgoyne, what he did not know is that there was a large force of 1,800 militia under General John Stark. They were in Bennington, right where the supply depot was. They weren't supposed to be there, at least according to the British and the Germans. But so the Germans went over there expecting to see very, very light resistance, and instead they run into 1,800 guys and General John Stark, and he was a really tough customer. The commander, before he didn't bug out, and he's certainly not going to attack this force, he writes to Burgoyne for reinforcements. Meanwhile, Stark divided his forces into 3 columns. One to demonstrate in the Germans' front, and demonstrate is kind of like make a half-hearted attack. It's just you march up there and you make a show of attacking, and the whole point is to tie up a chunk of the army so they can't go somewhere else. So kind of tie them up, tie them down, whatever you want to call it. The second part of Stark's force, the American militia, they were going to slip around the right flank, and the third was going to slip around the left flank. So a classic turning maneuver, or even enveloping maneuver, we can say. Stark said to his army, "There are the redcoats, and they are ours. Or Molly Stark sleeps a widow tonight." Again, who knows if that was really said, but it's a great quote. In other words, we're going to capture them or we're going to die. And the plan worked perfectly. The Germans were surrounded and they quickly surrendered. On August 16th, 700 German reinforcements arrived, but there's the reinforcements you asked for. They too were attacked by Stark and they retreated. In all, the Germans lost 200 dead, 700 missing, and 4 cannon. The Americans lost only 30 killed and 40 wounded. So if we sum that up, 70 total casualties for the Americans as opposed to 900 or so, give or take, of the Germans. So that's a big chunk of Burgoyne's force that is now gone. They're not coming back. Not only are they not coming back with no supplies, they're just flat out not coming back. So Burgoyne loses close to 1,000 guys, which he can ill afford to lose.
This is exactly what we talked about at the top of the episode, that when British lose someone, it's very hard to replenish the numbers. And in the previous episode, we mentioned that Hessians are excellent at deserting and blending into America. So I like to think that at that exact spot where the Hessians were captured, there was an immediate colony that was set up where there are Germans claiming, "Oh yeah, we are German Mennonites. We've been here for years. We are just simple blacksmiths and craftsmen." Yeah,
Yeah,
so,
no, das ist gut, yeah.
Well, okay. Burgoyne's plan is going pretty poorly, and there's a lot more to uncover here and see how things actually unfold with Saratoga, because we see a lot of great stories of action with the people that we've met previously. What do you think, James? Should we make this a two-parter, stop here, and then kick it up with another episode next time?
Let's do that. We've given everybody the background, and we've seen a couple of the march, and now we're about ready to get to the main battle.
All right, yeah. The march continues in the next episode, and we'll see the main battle of Saratoga. See you then. Thanks for listening to the Key Battles of the Revolutionary War podcast. If you'd like more info, go to keybattlesoftherevolutionarywar.com, where you'll find show notes, maps, and other resources that we talk about in these episodes. And if you like the show, please rate and review us on the podcast player of your choice. It helps us grow the show and reach new listeners. Until next time, my friends, grab your tankard of ale or glass of Madeira and raise a toast to liberty.